The gallery smelled of ozone and cold stone, that particular mineral sharpness that accumulates when a building's ventilation is older than the republic it serves. Elias Vance noticed this because he noticed everything now. Not wisdom, reflex, the kind that develops when survival becomes the only project you have left. He set his battered leather folio on the defense table and did not look at the judges. The Galactic Council's High Court of Adjudication occupied the top 3 tiers of the hegemony spire, a structure so old that 3 civilizations had built on top of one another's foundations without bothering to demolish what came before. The result was something architecturally honest about the nature of power, layer upon layer of conquest dressed as construction. Elias had spent 6 months studying those layers. He found them instructive. High Arbiter Vex presided from the central dais, a Velhari male, pale as old bone, with the elongated skull that marked his judicial caste. His robes were the deep violet of a bruise that hasn't decided whether to heal or spread. He read from a data crystal without looking up. Around him, the council members arranged themselves in the tiered semicircle that galactic law required for proceedings of this classification. 16 species, 16 sets of eyes, all of them aimed at the single human being standing at the defense table below. Humanity stands accused of unlawful proliferation across 47 star systems. The charge hung in the chamber the way a very large stone hangs in the moment after it has been dropped but before it has hit anything. In the public galleries, species that had spent centuries developing incompatible body languages leaned forward in what was, across all their variations, a single unified posture of anticipation. Correspondents, ambassadors, representatives of civilizations whose borders humanity had dissolved, settled, collapsed, poisoned, and purchased at terms no rational entity would accept. They were here to watch a species finally answer for itself. Elias stood. He had not slept in 31 hours. His suit was the last good one he owned, charcoal gray, earth-made, cut before the fall from fabric that no longer existed because the looms that made it no longer existed, because the city those looms had occupied no longer existed. He kept it for occasions that required the appearance of authority without its substance. Today, qualified. I invoke the Chronicle Clause, Article 3, Subsection 9, the right of historical context. Vex's pen stopped moving. The gallery shifted. Somewhere in the upper tier, a translator array cycled through 17 languages to render those particular words in terms that every species present could parse, and still the silence that followed felt universal. The silence of a room that has just heard something and is still deciding what it heard. Vex looked up. And how long does this context require, Ambassador? Elias allowed himself a slight smile. It did not reach his eyes. His eyes had not held warmth in 11 years, not since a transport called the Shenandoah became a streak of light across what was left of Earth's sky, and he had watched its transponder signal on a board in the Azores Plateau relay station until the signal stopped, and then kept giving orders anyway, because the alternative was nothing. Galactic law guarantees the defendant sufficient time, Arbiter. I'll let you know when the full chronicle is complete. The Chronicle Clause was not obscure law. It was the sort of procedural relic that appears in legal codes when civilizations grow old enough to start worrying about silencing the wrong defendant. It guaranteed any accused party the right to provide complete historical context before a verdict could be rendered. The drafters had imagined accused kings, displaced empires, the occasional religious schism requiring careful narration. They had not imagined Elias Vance. Vex understood the play within 30 seconds. Elias could see it, the slight contraction around those pale eyes, the change in the set of his jaw. The Arbiter was fast. Elias gave him that. But understanding a trap is not the same as being outside it. The first flashback Elias offered the court was the fall of Earth. He described it in the careful cadence of a man recounting a tragedy for the 800th time. which he was, deploying phrases like strategic dispersal and multi-vector genetic preservation with the flat precision of a prepared statement. The evacuation of Earth, he told them, was calculated, orderly, a testament to human foresight in the face of extinction-level catastrophe. He paused briefly to drink from his water glass. The sound of it was audible in the silence. The court heard this version. What existed in the inaccessible memory behind Elias's steady voice was different. He had been 29 years old, standing in the relay station on the Azores Plateau, and the comms board in front of him was lit red from top to bottom. Every relay, every frequency. The noise on those channels was not the noise of strategic dispersal. It was the noise of 80 million people trying to become something other than ash in the span of 6 hours. He had a headset, a coordinate list, and a daughter named Maya, who was 7 years old and boarding the ARC ship Shenandoah with his sister because he was here, giving orders, because someone had to give orders, because the alternative was chaos, and chaos was the same as giving up, and giving up was not something Elias Vance knew how to do. He had watched the Shenandoah's transponder on his board. He had watched it stop. He had kept giving orders. The court did not hear that version, but it lived in every sentence of the version they did hear, compressed and transmuted and weaponized into something Elias had spent 11 years sharpening to a point. The second charge arrived wrapped in bureaucratic precision. 14 human vessels, appearing in the Viridian quarantine zone within 6 months of Earth's fall. Unauthorized entry, sensor logs, timestamps, deliberate course corrections logged by the ship's own navigation systems. Vex laid them out with the methodical satisfaction of someone who has prepared extensively and expects to win. The air in the chamber was colder now, the ventilation cycling through whatever algorithm governed its afternoon setting on this world. Elias felt it against the back of his neck. Explain why 14 human vessels appeared in the Viridian quarantine zone within 6 months of Earth's fall. Navigational drift, Arbiter. Our AI systems were compromised by collective grief. Machines can't mourn, but they can malfunction when their operators are in trauma. The pause he left after the word grief was precisely calculated, long enough for the image to settle, not long enough to seem theatrical. He had practiced this particular pause for 2 weeks. The reality was that Captain Chen had hot-wired the slipspace drive on the colony transport Resilience while laughing at her own joke about plausible deniability. The mineral rights in the Viridian zone were worth more than most planetary GDPs. The grief was real. He would grant them that much. But grief had not navigated those ships through the quarantine perimeter with coordinates accurate to 4 decimal places. Chen had. Vex produced the sensor logs showing deliberate course corrections. Elias studied them with appropriate solemnity. The logs were accurate. The argument he was about to make was also accurate. The fact that both things could be simultaneously true was the engine that had driven human legal strategy since before the fall. Can you prove intent, Arbiter? Or merely capability? Galactic Precedent, Case 447. Accidental trespass requires proof of mens rea. The Latin landed strangely in a chamber full of alien jurists. Elias had kept it deliberately, an untranslatable artifact from a dead world, carrying the weight of a legal tradition that no longer had a planet to practice on. Let them process that alongside the argument. Proceed, Vex said, through what sounded like teeth he was carefully not gritting. The third charge was ecological. Bacteria, terraforming spores, the slow chemical conquest of dead worlds that had, by the time anyone bothered to look closely, become breathing worlds, breathing with human-engineered microbes that had a particular appetite for native atmospheric chemistry. 3 systems in Sector 7 now processed oxygen at rates incompatible with their original biome. The Council's Environmental Board had prepared a 400-page report. Elias had read it. He had found it thorough and, in its own way, admirable. Vex called it bioterrorism. Elias produced Permit 7743B, authorized by Assistant Clerk Zix of the Outer Territories Board 187 cycles ago. The document was real. He had found it in the hegemony's own archives, buried in a decade of administrative backlog that nobody had audited since the original clerk retired. He placed it on the submission table with the care of a man who knows exactly how much a piece of paper can weigh. It's not a bioweapon, Arbiter. It's aggressive gardening. If you outlaw gardens, only outlaws will have flowers. A sound moved through the gallery. Not laughter. Something more uncomfortable than laughter. The sound of people recognizing a punchline they don't want to find funny and finding it funny anyway. A junior clerk cannot authorize Galactic Precedent 891. A signature is a signature, regardless of rank. Unless you're suggesting your own bureaucracy is invalid. The cold in the chamber had a texture now, the particular temperature of a room where everyone has simultaneously realized that the walls are closer than they appeared when they walked in. Vex called for a recess at the 8-hour mark. Reasonable. Any jurist would. He was tired. The council members flanking him had the glazed alertness of people running on diplomatic training and inadequate nutrition. Elias had known he would call it. He stood sharply. Objection. Truth-Seeking Protocol, Section 4. Once narrative testimony has begun, interruption constitutes procedural bias and grounds for mistrial. That protocol applies to witness testimony, not, I am a witness, Arbiter, to my own species' history. You cannot break the narrative flow without invalidating everything I've said. And if this trial is invalidated, he let the pause open into the chamber. We start over, from the beginning. The gallery went still. One council member made a sound that the translator array rendered as a species-specific expression of profound institutional dismay. Others whispered in the fractured shorthand of people who cannot believe what they are hearing and need confirmation. Vex looked at him across the width of the chamber. The question he asked was not anger. It was something older than anger. The flat, exhausted register of a man who has understood the scope of what has been done to him and is still searching for the way through it. How much longer, Ambassador? As long as truth requires, Arbiter. Somewhere beyond the hegemony spire, in the dark between star systems where sensors did not reach and the only light was engine bloom, Admiral Zhao stood before a countdown hologram and watched numbers fall. Time to weapons range, 28 hours. Her comms officer looked up from his board. And the trial? Elias says he can give us 40. Keep the engines hot. The hologram threw blue light across her face. She did not look triumphant. She looked like someone executing a plan that has gone exactly as expected, which is its own particular kind of cold. Back in the chamber, Elias allowed himself one small thing. Not a smile. A relaxation. The particular easing of a muscle held tight for too long. The first full breath after a long submersion. For 11 years he had been building toward something he could not name, because naming it would have made it feel like hope, and hope was a currency that required a future to spend it in. He was winning something finally that she would never know about. The trial had barely begun. No one in that chamber could have said with certainty when it would end, except Elias Vance, who had known the answer for 6 months, 47 hours, to the minute. The problem with running a filibuster is that you have to keep talking, not just talking, performing. Each argument Elias placed before the court needed to be plausible enough to require refutation, complex enough to require analysis, and emotionally resonant enough to hold the chamber's attention through hour 12, hour 19, hour 27. The audience changed in composition as the hours passed. The casual gallery fillers cycling out, replaced by the hardened correspondents and diplomatic observers who had decided that this particular proceeding was the most important thing happening in the galaxy, and would remain so until it concluded. They were not wrong. They didn't know how right they were. Elias was good at this. He had not known how good until he began. The first contact war arrived at hour 11. He reframed it, in the measured cadence he had rehearsed for 6 months, as a series of tragic misunderstandings between grieving refugees and aggressive patrol vessels moving through a border zone with insufficient communication protocols. He described the colony ships in his version as desperate and lightly armed. Barely functional transports crewed by people who had lost everything and whose navigation systems registered any approaching vessel as a potential extinction event because the last approaching vessels they had known had turned Earth's thermosphere into a crematorium. The first contact incident was a tragic misunderstanding during a refugee crisis. Vex didn't reach for his notes. His voice had a quality now. The quality of a man who has decided that civility is both mandatory and expensive, and who is watching his reserves deplete in real time. You fired first. We defended ourselves against what appeared to be an aggressive sensor sweep. The colony ships in Elias's version were desperate and human and comprehensible in their fear. The colony ships in the classified after-action files, which Elias had read, memorized and sealed behind 4 layers of security clearance before boarding the transport to this chamber, were Admiral Petrov's Q ships, massive dreadnoughts in colony barge clothing, point defense cannons buried inside antenna arrays, instructions to engage on first sensor contact and log it as self-defense, because the word self-defense was load-bearing in Galactic Precedent Case 447 and Petrov's legal team had done their homework. The translator arrays cycled. The gallery absorbed the testimony with the uncomfortable attentiveness of an audience that has begun to understand that the show they are watching is not the show they came to see. Something had shifted in hour 11 that Elias could feel without being able to precisely locate. A change in the chamber's social temperature, the collective recalibration of every observer who had arrived expecting a guilty man defending himself and was now watching something else. The collapsed star arrived at hour 17. The air in the chamber had changed by then, flatter, drier, with the particular staleness that accumulates when a sealed space has been occupied continuously for most of a day. Elias could feel it in his throat. He drank from his water glass with deliberate care before continuing. The sound of water, the sound of a man in no hurry. The G7 stellar demolition, the Council's term, delivered with the flat outrage of an environmental board that had spent 3 years preparing its indictment, had produced an unsanctioned wormhole that cut travel time to the hegemony capital by 80%. Dr. Chen's team had placed the charges 6 months before anyone officially noticed anything was wrong. The calculations, Elias told the court, had been imprecise. A tragic mishap of early post-Earth resource science. The grief of a species displaced from its home world producing cascading errors in what should have been routine stellar hydrogen harvesting procedures. He described Dr. Chen in his version as a weeping figure in a white laboratory coat who had simply miscalculated the yield. We are terribly sorry, Arbiter, for accidentally shortening your supply routes by 8 decades. A tragic efficiency. Something moved through the gallery. Not laughter. Elias had stopped producing laughter at hour 9 when he understood the composition of his remaining audience. This was something more sophisticated and less comfortable. The sound of beings recognizing that they are watching a master performance and being unable to separate their admiration from their alarm. Vex's voice had acquired a new quality. Still controlled, still the precision instrument of a Velari jurist at full operational capacity, but underneath it something that was beginning to sound like weather. The distant low register of a system building pressure with nowhere to release it. This violates the Stellar Conservation Act, which allows exceptions for unintended scientific outcomes. Section 12C. The Stellar Conservation Act's Section 12C had been written for laboratory accidents, containment failures, poorly shielded reactors producing unexpected cascade effects in a controlled environment. It had not been written for the deliberate, precisely calculated demolition of a main sequence star by a military engineering team operating under a falsified civilian manifest. Elias knew this. He cited the clause anyway, because the clause existed, and because Vex would need 3 days and a full legal team to prove the distinction, and 3 days was not something this proceeding had. "Proceed," Vex said, with the tone of a man depositing a debt he intends to collect later. The economic charges arrived at hour 22. Elias consumed another glass of water before they began. He was managing his biology the way he managed everything else, with attention to margins and an awareness that the body is a system with constraints, and constraints managed deliberately are different from constraints encountered by surprise. Predatory trade practices, market destabilization, the Altair Consortium bankruptcy, which had cascaded through 3 regional economies and left 17 alien worlds economically dependent on human supply chains within a decade. The Council's economic analysts had spent 18 months on their report. It was thorough and accurate and documented with a precision that Elias found genuinely impressive. "We offered aid, technology sharing, charitable uplift. You bankrupted the Altair Consortium. Is it a crime to be generous, Arbiter, to share the fruits of innovation?" Vex's response was immediate. "When the fruit is poisoned with dependency—" "Careful, Arbiter, you're sounding anti-refugee." The pause that followed was long enough that Elias could hear the ventilation cycling. He let it run. Every silence he controlled was a silence the court was not spending on a verdict. The reality of the trade strategy was, in its own way, elegant. Flood the market, undercut by 40%. Absorb the losses for 5 years. The time it takes for a competitor to commit to infrastructure they cannot reverse. Then, when their hospital systems and transit networks and agricultural processors all run on human engineering because human engineering was free for 5 years and now it is not, raise the prices. It was not a crime. It was a business model so old that humanity had practiced it on itself before it had ever encountered another intelligent species. The distinction between weaponized generosity and genuine philanthropy was a matter of jurisdiction and documentation. Humanity had managed both carefully. The air had weight now. Not unpleasantly. The weight of a room where something important is being decided, where every word is being measured against everything else. But palpably, Elias could feel the attention of 200 observers as a physical thing, directional, oriented at him the way a sensor array orients toward a signal. Clerk Nix entered at hour 26. He was a young Tethian, blue-gray, compact, with the anxious precision of a junior official who has recently realized that the proceeding he has been assigned to is not the proceeding he was told he was assigned to. The procedural reminder was mandated by hegemony law, a notification at the midpoint of every judicial cycle, logged and filed regardless of what was currently occurring in the chamber. The system required it the way systems require all things they were designed to require, without awareness of context or consequence. High Arbiter, procedural reminder. We've reached the halfway point of the judicial cycle. Vex did not look up from the submission he was reviewing. Yes, log it and file the report. The clerk hesitated. It was a small thing, the hesitation, a beat of stillness between acknowledgement and departure that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than protocol required. But Elias had been watching for it. He had known, 6 months ago in a strategy room with Admiral Zhao and legal analyst Dr. Quan, that Clerk Nix would hesitate. He had not known Nix specifically, but he had known the type, a junior official with enough procedural knowledge to understand what the halfway mark meant in the context of the testimony currently being presented, and not enough institutional authority to do anything about it, except hesitate. "Sir, if we don't render a verdict before the cycle completes—" "I'm aware of the statute, Clerk Nix. We'll finish in time." Nix filed. He left. His hesitation remained in the room like a scent, faint enough that only someone already looking would have noticed it. Vex had not looked. He was managing too many variables to notice one junior clerk's 2 seconds of excess stillness in the doorway. That was the design. Elias reached for his water glass. Hour 30 brought the neutral zones, the slow calcification of temporary refugee camps into permanent infrastructure, the 20-year accumulation of schools, hospitals, mines, and children who had known no other home and who would resist evacuation, not with weapons, but with the simple, immovable weight of existence. The Council had issued evacuation orders 30 cycles ago. Vex produced them. They were stamped, logged, and completely real. Elias produced the expression of precise regret he had been saving for this moment. We never received them. Perhaps they were sent to Earth? A pause. Oh, right. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the previous ones, not the silence of a chamber watching strategy unfold, but the silence of 200 observers confronting a specific kind of cruelty, the use of catastrophic loss as an administrative excuse, and not having a language for their discomfort. Vex's hand moved slightly toward his gavel and then stopped. There was no procedural grounds for a gaveling here. There was only the silence. Proceed, Vex said very quietly. Hour 35. Cultural exchange. A decade of human art, music, and literature broadcast across alien networks under the framework of the Post-Earth Diaspora Cultural Preservation Initiative, a real program, with real funding, administered by a real agency, that existed primarily to provide legal cover for what the propaganda ministry called cultural conquest, and what Elias called, in the chamber, the natural desire of a grieving species to share the things it was afraid of losing. If your cultures are so fragile that exposure to art destabilizes them, perhaps that's a flaw in your systems, not ours. Vex, at hour 38, had the look of a Velhari diplomat who has spent the equivalent of a standard day and a half in the same chair and has recently reviewed his legal options and found them unacceptably constrained. Something in his posture had shifted from prosecutorial to geological, the flat, layered compression of a formation under enormous pressure, waiting to determine whether it will break or simply become something harder. Hour 38, Arbiter. Shall I continue? Vex looked at him across that long chamber. Across the accumulated hours, across the accumulated lies wrapped in accurate facts, and the accurate facts wrapped in misleading framing, and the misleading framing built on a procedural architecture that had been 6 months in construction, and was holding hour by hour exactly as designed. You'll continue until I say otherwise, Ambassador. Elias reached for his water glass. In the narrow strip of viewport visible along the chamber's upper level, the stars had completed their slow transit across the local sky. The second night of the trial, cycling past, the local dark, moving through its appointed hours with the indifference of a system that has been performing this function for billions of years and will continue regardless of what is decided in the chamber below it. Admiral Zhao's countdown hologram, somewhere in the dark beyond the viewport's reach, had been ticking for 38 hours. Time to weapons range, 9 hours, and falling. The engines were hot. The board was almost set. All that remained was one more act of a 47-hour performance, and a man with a water glass and a room that could not make it stop. Hour 40 arrived, not with drama, but with exhaustion, the kind that accumulates in sealed rooms where too many beings have spent too long breathing the same recycled air. The ventilation worked, but worked the way an old system works, adequately, without conviction. Elias could feel the hours in his lower back, in the particular tightness behind his eyes that was not quite pain, but had learned to occupy the same address. He chose not to notice any of it. There were 7 hours remaining in the Judicial Cycle. Vex had prepared something for this session. The Arbiter's posture had changed, shed the geological patience of the previous hours, replaced with something coiled, more precise. The posture of a man who has spent a break consulting his legal team through channels that technically should not have been available to him during an active proceeding, because the truth-seeking protocol had been in effect, and Elias had been watching those channels. He had been watching those channels very carefully. "We have sensor logs from the Kepler Station massacre." Vex's voice was flat and cold and carefully stripped of everything except the words themselves. "Your ships, your munitions, 4,000 civilians dead." The charge landed differently than the others. Not because it was more serious. They had covered stellar demolition, weaponized trade, bacteria that ate biospheres. It landed differently because it was true in a way the other charges were true only with careful framing. This one sat on the table without procedural cover. 4,000. The number was its own argument. The number was, Elias suspected, the thing Vex had been building toward since hour one, conserving it like a weapon you only carry one of, waiting for the moment when everything else had failed. He felt the first faint trace of actual sweat along his collar. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared for it. Preparation is not the same as comfort. A rogue cell, unaffiliated with any official. "They broadcast your naval codes, Ambassador." The words landed flat and the chamber held them. 4,000. The number sat between them on the air. Elias did not look away from the Arbiter. He had learned in 11 years of carrying the Shenandoah's transponder silence like a stone in his chest that there is a version of looking away that is performed with the eyes open. The interior retreat, the soft focus that passes for confrontation while something behind the face goes elsewhere. He did not permit it. He held Vex's gaze and let the number sit there. The Kepler Station operation. He had never permitted himself to use its operational name in his own thoughts. It had been conceived and executed by people who had resigned their official positions before the operation was approved. That was technically true, in the way many things in human strategy were technically true. But the naval codes had not been changed when those people resigned, and the munitions had come from a depot that still carried human government identification numbers, and the sensor logs showed what they showed. 4,000. He pivoted. "You want to talk about rules of war, Arbiter? Then let's discuss the Kendra Protocols. Which species here hasn't violated them? Shall we open those files?" He let the pause open like a door that swings in both directions. "Truth cuts both ways, Arbiter." The silence that followed was different from every previous silence in the proceeding. Not the silence of a chamber watching strategy, but the silence of 16 species calculating, simultaneously and privately, what it would mean if Elias did open those files, what was in them, whether this was a bluff, whether the distinction between bluff and threat mattered when the man making it had nothing left to lose and a fleet in weapons range. Vex's face did not change, but the council members flanking him exchanged looks that the translator array could not render, because they were not language. They were the facial equivalent of a very quiet conversation between people who have just realized they are all implicated in the same exposure. The Kendra Protocol files were real. Elias had reviewed them. Every species in that chamber had a section. He was not going to open them. He didn't need to. He only needed the question to hang in the air long enough for the calculation to complete in 16 different sets of minds. The most useful threats are the ones that never have to be carried out. He had made the most morally straightforward calculation of the entire trial. Take the worst charge they had, the one that had no adequate procedural defense, and detonate it into a mutual threat that nobody in the room wanted to see actually triggered. He was not proud of the calculation. He was not particularly ashamed of it either. Shame was a luxury. Survival was a practice. He had been practicing it for 11 years. The hour was 42 when Vex deployed the hostage gambit. Elias had expected hour 44. The early timing told him the Arbiter was rattled. The Kendra Protocol move had cost Vex more than it had appeared to cost, had driven him to a prepared contingency sooner than the plan called for. That told Elias something useful about how much the Arbiter had left in reserve. Vex leaned forward. The lean itself was informative. The physical breach of judicial posture communicating, without language, how much control was currently being exercised and at what personal cost. Ambassador, we have your family's transport manifest. The Serenity's hope. If you've lied about any of this, they're complicit. Accessories to war crimes. Silence. Elias laughed. It came out wrong. Not the practiced sounds he had deployed throughout the preceding hours. The calibrated variations of legal confidence and appropriate regret and controlled passion. This laugh was hollow and bitter in the way of something that has been kept in a sealed container for too long and has changed its nature. The chamber heard it, and the chamber understood, even across species barriers and translation algorithms, that this was not a tactical sound. The Serenity's hope, Arbiter. That was the ship after the Shenandoah. A pause, long enough to be real. My daughter Maya was on the Shenandoah. He did not say the rest of it. He did not describe the thrusters failing, the wrong re-entry angle, the 4 seconds between a ship and nothing. He did not describe watching a transponder signal on a board in the Azores relay station and keeping his voice level into a headset because the coordinate list was still running and there were still ships in the queue, and the alternative to continuing was a silence that would have killed more people than the silence inside him already had. He said none of it. He let what he did say carry all of it. So threaten me again, Arbiter. Threaten the family of a man who's already dead inside. See how far it gets you. You cannot threaten a dead man's ghosts. The courtroom went silent in a way it had not gone silent before. Not the attentive silence of witnesses tracking strategy. Not the calculating silence of species managing their exposure. Something else. The silence of a room that has been reminded, without wanting to be reminded, that underneath the procedure and the legal citations and the tactical brilliance, there is a man who lost a 7-year-old girl in a burning sky 11 years ago and has been carrying that forward ever since. The silence of discomfort. The silence of beings who have, until this moment, been watching a chess game and have just realized that the board is made of bone. Even Vex went still. Elias watched the Arbiter's posture change, watched him recalibrate the opponent he was facing. Not stronger, not weaker, simply different in a way that changed the mathematics of what was possible. He was not fighting a lawyer. He was fighting a man who had spent 11 years becoming whatever the trial required him to be, and who would spend however many hours remained becoming something more. The council fractured at hour 43. Vex received a message on his judicial relay, and Elias watched him read it. Watched his face go pale from the center outward in the particular Velhari fashion. The blood retreating as if the biology itself was conceding something the mind had not yet processed. The message's arrival was expected. The timing was slightly ahead of schedule, which meant the human diplomatic team had accelerated their negotiation track by approximately 90 minutes. Efficient. 4 council members had signed non-aggression pacts with humanity during the trial, their seals on the documents, binding under galactic law, effective immediately. Vex looked up from the message. His voice, for the first time in 43 hours, did not sound entirely controlled. This tribunal will recess for objection, narrative flow. 4 council members have just signed non-aggression pacts with humanity during this trial. Elias allowed his expression to convey an appropriate mixture of surprise and philosophical regret. Is that my fault, Arbiter? Or perhaps they've heard my testimony and decided humanity might make better allies than enemies. The deal was simpler than the testimony surrounding it. 400 ships within strike range of 4 homeworlds, plus trade routes, plus a guarantee of border inviolability and perpetuity, plus early access technology licensing at favorable rates. The alien ambassadors who signed had done the same calculation any rational actor would do when presented with those terms, and had arrived at the same answer. They would be very lonely when the council structure collapsed under the weight of what was coming, or they could be warm and wealthy and positioned correctly on the correct side of history. The mathematics were not complicated. This is extortion. It's diplomacy, Arbiter. Isn't that what you wanted? For humanity to negotiate? Hour 43, Arbiter, tick-tock. Vex stood. It was a small gesture, and it was not a small gesture. The High Arbiter of the Galactic Council's adjudication court had maintained judicial posture for 43 hours. The moment he left it, something about the formal architecture of the proceeding shifted, became confrontational in a way that the procedure could acknowledge but not contain. The chamber felt it. Every observer in the gallery felt it. The translator arrays cycled through the ambient sounds of 16 species' collective awareness that they were watching something cross a threshold. Enough. I know you're lying. You know you're lying. This entire testimony is fiction. Elias stood to meet him. Then prove it. The two words sat in the space between them. Vex's jaw tightened. We have proof. Surveillance. Intercepts. Ah. One syllable. Elias let it land, and then let the silence after it land, and then spoke into that silence. So you've been spying on us, in violation of the observation protocols, which means any evidence you present is inadmissible. The realization moved across Vex's face in stages. Elias had watched this process in his imagination so many times over the preceding 6 months that watching it in reality felt almost redundant. The mechanism engaging, the understanding arriving, the understanding deepening into something that had no diplomatic register, only the flat, interior recognition of a trap that has completed its cycle. You wanted us to spy on you. I wanted you to be exactly what you are, Arbiter, a bureaucracy so obsessed with rules that you'll violate them to enforce them. And now you can't use your evidence without admitting you're no better than us. A data crystal on the clerk's table made a faint sound as it settled. The ventilation moved air. In the gallery, a correspondent from a species whose name translated roughly as the considered had stopped writing entirely and was simply watching. The chamber held its breath in whatever biological equivalent 17 species maintained for that particular state. Elias looked at the chronometer on the chamber's rear wall. So here's where we are. You can't convict me without evidence. You can't use your evidence without invalidating your own authority. And you can't dismiss the case without... He paused, looked at the clock. Let Vex look at the clock. Well, that's for the next hour, Arbiter. He sat down, reached for his water glass. Drank. Across the chamber, Vex remained standing, looking at the man at the defense table, at the charcoal gray suit and the battered folio and the water glass, at the hollowed eyes of someone who had been dead inside for 11 years and had spent those years building something out of the wreckage. Building precisely this. Looking at him the way you look at a system you thought you understood when you first encountered the thing it was actually designed to do. 4 hours remained in the judicial cycle. There was no longer any question of what was going to happen. There was only the question of whether Vex would understand, when it happened, that it had been inevitable from the moment a man stood up in this chamber and invoked a clause about sufficient time with a slight smile that did not reach his eyes. Hour 47 arrived the way all terminal hours arrive. Quietly, without announcement, indistinguishable from the hours before it, until you looked at the clock and the clock told you what you were standing in. Elias looked at the clock. He had been looking at clocks for 6 months. The countdown in the strategy room, the chrono display above Admiral Zhao's hologram, the small unit he kept in his jacket pocket through the transit to this chamber, the institutional chronometer mounted on the court's rear wall that he had been checking with what appeared to be casual frequency since the first hour of the proceeding. He looked at it now, and the numbers confirmed what he had calculated and recalculated to the point where the calculation had become a kind of meditation. 47 judicial hours elapsed. A full cycle complete. The gallery had filled again overnight. Word had moved through the capital in the hours when Elias had been discussing cultural contamination and neutral zone settlements. moved through diplomatic channels and press relays and the informal networks of beings who understand that they are witnessing something that will have a name in legal textbooks before it has a name in the official record. The chamber was at capacity. The overflow galleries were operating. A translation relay had been established for the outer corridors. The audience for the ending had assembled without being told there was an ending coming. Vex called a vote. He had recovered some of his composure in the final hours, gathered it around himself with the practiced discipline of a Velhari jurist who has been maintaining judicial posture across his entire career and knows how to perform it even when it is no longer entirely genuine. He called for the vote with the correct procedural language and the correct tone and the correct placement of his gavel on the sound block. He was doing everything right. He had been doing everything right for 47 hours. I'm calling a vote. We will render a verdict now. On what authority? On the authority of this council to... Check the time, Arbiter. The words fell into the chamber with the particular weight of something that has been waiting a long time to be said. Vex stopped. The council members stopped. In the gallery, the translation arrays finished their cycle, and the words reached 200 observers in 17 languages, more or less simultaneously, and the chamber went still in the way that chambers go still when everyone in them has just understood that they are at the moment they will be describing for the rest of their lives. Vex looked at the chronometer. 47 judicial hours. The full cycle elapsed. His face did the thing faces do when understanding arrives faster than the muscles can arrange themselves. A moment of exposure, raw as a wound, before the professional composure closed over it. He looked at the chronometer for what felt like a long time and was probably 4 seconds, and then he looked back at Elias with something in his pale eyes that was not anger and was not despair, and was something that had no clean translation across the species barrier. Galactic Law, Section 8, Paragraph 4. Elias kept his voice level, descriptive, the tone of a man reading something that requires no interpretation. Any territorial claim uncontested for the duration of a full judicial cycle is ratified as legal precedent. That law applies to property disputes, not... It applies to any claim presented before this council. I have spent 47 hours outlining humanity's territorial presence across 47 star systems. You have listened, you have questioned, you have challenged my evidence and my framing and my legal citations, but you have not formally rejected a single claim. Vex's voice had lost its controlled quality. The control was still there, visible in the set of his jaw, in the precise stillness of his hands, but the voice itself was moving through something that the control could not entirely contain, because we couldn't, not without violating procedure. And now the cycle is complete. By your laws, Arbiter, our borders are ratified. Every system I named, every colony, every installation, every piece of infrastructure that humanity built in what you called unauthorized space. Legal, precedent, automatic. The word automatic fell like a final stone into still water. You can still convict me, Arbiter, but you can't undo the borders. The statute is automatic. The chamber absorbed this in stages, the way a very large piece of information travels through an audience, reaching different people at different depths, at different speeds. In the gallery, Elias could see the moment moving across the room in the form of changed postures, interrupted conversations, beings turning to other beings with expressions that needed no translation. The correspondents were writing. They had been writing continuously for 47 hours. But they were writing differently now, faster, with the quality of urgency that distinguishes recording an event from recording its meaning. In the diplomatic sections, he could see the 4 ambassadors who had signed the non-aggression pacts and the expressions on the faces of the 12 who hadn't, and the expressions were not the same. When I told you I would take sufficient time, Arbiter, Elias said, and his voice was very quiet now, I meant exactly 47 hours, to the minute. The evacuation of Earth lasted 47 hours. I chose the Chronicle Clause because the minimum sufficient time to tell the complete story of humanity's diaspora was precisely the length of a full judicial cycle. It has always been precisely that. A pause. Every word, every tangent, every moment I extended a flashback past its natural end. Every time I reached for my water glass, every objection to your recesses. I was not improvising, Arbiter. I was executing a schedule. Vex said nothing. There was nothing procedural to say. The greatest weapon in this galaxy isn't a gun. You taught me that. You and every civilization represented in this chamber, who built a system of laws so comprehensive and so rigorously enforced that the system itself became the most powerful force in known space. You were right. I simply learned to aim it. He paused one final time, letting the complete shape of the thing occupy the chamber. It's a well-written law and a patient lawyer. That's all it took. 6 months before the trial, in a room that smelled of recycled ship air and the particular tension of people who are planning something they cannot afford to have fail, Elias had sat across a table from Admiral Zhao and legal analyst Dr. Quan, and a star map that covered 3 walls. The map showed 47 systems. The map showed fleet positions. The map showed, in red overlay, the countdown that governed everything. The statute of limitations is 47 judicial hours, Dr. Quan had said. If we can make the trial last that long, while our fleets move into position, Zhao had continued, then we don't need to win the trial. We just need to survive it. Quan had looked at the star map, and then at Elias, and then at the star map again. But 47 hours of testimony, what could you possibly talk about? Elias had allowed himself, in that room, in the company of people who were doing what he was doing and understanding why. A grim smile. The first genuine expression he could remember making in years. Everything. And nothing. The truth and every beautiful lie I can wrap around it. Now, in the chamber, Elias's datapad chimed once. A single notification. He glanced at the screen beneath the edge of the defense table, where the court's cameras could not resolve it. Admiral Zhao's message was 4 words. The board is ours. He allowed himself to think of Maya, not the image he usually carried, the fixed photograph of a 7-year-old, static, preserved in amber, but something more like a conversation, something he had not permitted himself in 11 years because permitting it would have meant opening the door that the grief lived behind, and opening that door during the 47 hours of the trial would have meant losing. He opened it now, briefly, in the privacy behind his neutral expression. We made it, sweetheart. He closed the notification and looked up. Vex had conferred with the council members flanking him in the urgent, abbreviated shorthand of people who have just been informed that the situation they thought they were managing has already concluded. The conference took 4 minutes. It felt like watching the inside of something that has already broken, working through the motions of breaking. Elias watched without rushing it. When Vex turned back to face him, the Arbiter's composure was present, but reconstructed, rebuilt on different foundations than the ones it had occupied at the trial's beginning. Something had settled, finally, into the position that certainty occupies when certainty is no longer possible and you have to choose the next thing. You have not won, Ambassador. You have exploited a technicality. The entire galaxy will know what you are. Elias stood. History is written by the survivors, Arbiter, and we survived. Vex was quiet for a moment. The chamber was quiet. In the gallery, 200 beings waited for the thing they had come to witness, and knew they were waiting for it, and held still accordingly. This council dismisses all territorial charges on procedural grounds. A sound moved through the gallery. Not celebration, something more complicated and less clean. The sound of a verdict being absorbed by an audience that has understood for the past hour that the verdict was coming, and is now discovering that understanding something in advance does not blunt it when it arrives. Vex's voice did not waver. But let the record show, humanity is guilty of every crime they have been accused of. You are conquerors, liars, murderers. Yes. Elias's voice was level and not unkind. And now we are also legal. He gathered his notes. The folio, battered, earth-made, carried across 11 years of becoming whatever the moment required, went under his arm. He pushed back from the defense table. He stood in the chamber that smelled of ozone and cold stone, and the accumulated hours of 200 beings watching something that would have a name in legal textbooks before it had a name in history, and he paused. "For what it's worth, Arbiter." Vex looked at him, the pale eyes. The judicial caste? The being who had spent 47 hours trying to do the thing his institution had assigned him to do and had done it correctly and still lost. "I didn't enjoy this. But you gave us no choice. When the galaxy wouldn't make room for refugees, we made room ourselves. With bodies." The words were quiet. The words were the truest thing anyone had said in 47 hours. With whatever it took. He walked out. He stumbled once, slightly, at the chamber's threshold, a catch of the foot, a momentary loss of the carefully maintained steadiness, and recovered it and kept walking. He had not slept in 53 hours. He had spent 11 years building toward a moment that he had now left behind him, and that had not felt, in its arrival, like anything he had imagined it feeling like. Not triumph, not peace. Something more like the exhaustion that comes after a very long effort finally completes. The body recognizing that it no longer has to hold a particular shape and beginning, slowly, to let go of the holding. In the 6 months that followed, a young Tethian law student named Crix studied the case files and asked his professor how it had been possible. How one human with a folio and a water glass had restructured the legal status of 47 star systems in a single proceeding. The professor's answer occupied 4 seminar sessions. The short version: humanity had understood something the Council had forgotten. Laws are only as strong as the willingness to enforce them. When Elias Vance arrived with a Chronicle Clause citation and a countdown in his pocket, he did not fight the system. He became it. He moved through it the way current moves through a circuit, following every rule, exploiting every pathway, until the energy he was conducting arrived exactly where he had aimed it. And that, the professor told Crix, is the Exodus precedent. Not that humanity was innocent, not that the system failed, but that someone understood the design better than the designers, and had 47 hours and a dead daughter's name in his chest as fuel. Elias Vance served as the first human ambassador to the Galactic Council for 11 years following the trial. He was not, by any account of the beings who worked alongside him, a warm man. He was precise and patient, and occasionally capable of a dry humor that landed in translation with roughly 70% effectiveness, which he maintained was adequate. He was not the kind of man about whom people told affectionate stories. He was the kind of man about whom people told other kinds of stories. In the 9th year of his ambassadorship, he visited a human colony on a world that had no name yet, only a designation and the beginnings of the infrastructure that becomes a name when children grow up calling it home. A little girl ran up to him at the edge of the colony's central settlement, where prefab structures had given way to something that was starting to look in the way that things gradually start to look like themselves, like a town. "Are you the man from the stories? The one who talked to the aliens?" He knelt, which he did not do for very many beings. "I am. My teacher says you saved us." He looked at her, at the particular 7-year-oldness of her. The specific combination of energy and incomprehension and absolute certainty that the world is navigable. He looked at her in the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time and are not sure how to put down. "I just bought us time." He watched her run back to her friends, back into the settlement's morning noise, into the ordinary chaos of a species that had found itself a place in the stars, by means that would be argued about in law schools and ethics seminars for centuries. For the first time since the Azores relay station, since the board went red and the transponder stopped and he kept giving orders anyway, he let himself smile, not the slight, calculated smile of the defense table. Something else. Something that reached his eyes. He kept it brief. There was work tomorrow, and the day after, and the strategy required a long view. The aliens had thought in election cycles. Humanity thought in generations. His datapad showed the notification from Admiral Zhao, still open from the trial. Below it, a new message from the Colonial Education Board. The first alien children in the newly designated human-administered sectors were being taught history from human-produced materials. The long game, working. He closed the datapad. I hope you're watching, Maya. We found a place in the stars. The colony continued its morning around him. Children running, construction noise, the smell of turned earth, and something cooking in a nearby prefab that was, against all probability, identifiable as coffee. The stars over the colony, visible even in daylight on this world, were the same stars that had watched Earth burn and watched the Shenandoah fall and watched a man in a gray suit spend 47 hours in a chamber that smelled of ozone and cold stone, buying time with beautiful lies. They were also now the stars over 47 human-controlled systems. The galaxy had made room in the end. It had simply needed someone patient enough to explain where to stand.